like I was just saying, it would be good if we can all just have a short introduction, perhaps, to who you are and maybe your practice and where you're based and stuff like that, and then let it just be a informal, free-flowing conversation after that.
So my name is Farah Mullah, and I'm an artist and a researcher based in Mumbai. And my research is about how sound affects human subjectivity. So it deals a lot with how our acoustic environments mold us and help us navigate urban situations. And yes, and I'm based out of Mumbai.
She's got another issue right now. It's not going well.
Marcus?
Right.
Maybe you
So I'm an artist and researcher. I'm working mainly in the field of acoustic ecology, scientifically and artistically. So normally when I work on projects, I try to do both. At one hand, research, and at the other hand, trying to have a look on an object by artistic means, to investigate the object by artistic means. I'm based in Switzerland, Zurich, at the Zurich University of the Arts, and at ETH, where I do at the same time my PhD, which will hopefully soon be accomplished. Yes, that's it.
Hello, I'm Akash. I run a research lab called Soundcodes. I work as an artist and a researcher. In the work, uh, I try to understand and look at perception of us in terms of environment, in terms of space. Yeah, that's it. Right now, I don't know where I'm based off, but I'm on the internet.
All right, fine. So I thought maybe to start, it was a little bit my idea for today that since we met Farah, it's quite some years ago, and maybe I start telling you what I did in the meantime, just with slides, and that gives us maybe some points to discuss. Is that good?
Sounds good.
All right, so I try to share my screen. Yeah, that's just a few slides from the topic I was also announcing for our discussion today. So the relation between acoustic ecology and environmental art, between science and art, of course. So you know that very, very well. That was the installation that I showed when I was in Delhi for the Sound Reasons Festival. So that's quite a few years ago. I think maybe 5 years or something already.
I think it was 2014 or 15, approximately. It was a long while ago.
Yeah, 14, 15, yeah, some time ago. So that's the version with 5 screens I showed at Ars Electronica when we won the prize. So again, trees, what we showed that was Roman and me, Roman Zweifel. He is an ecophysiologist based at the Forest Landscape and Research. And what we did was we wired up that poor tree here in the Swiss Alps completely with ecophysiological sensors, but also acoustic sensors, because we wanted to investigate the sounds of trees under drought stress in the Swiss Alps. So what we did specially was we developed some special devices for being able to record the sounds of plants. It's this piezo element, which has a needle on it, soldered needle on it, that we could stick into the tissue and listen to the physiological sounds of plants. So you know all that, Farah, but the others maybe not. And after that project, right when we terminated it in the same valley in Switzerland, in Valais, I made some holidays after we arranged everything and brought back our equipment. So I had the equipment with me, and I was here in holidays, sitting in that meadow, and just out of curiosity, I stick the sensors that we developed for the plants into the soil. So basically, people living here in Switzerland, they know the sounds of meadows. They sound like this. So you hear something. It's very low, actually. So you hear the chirping grasshoppers, the wind blowing into the grass. So these are the sounds very well known of a meadow, but how does that sound in the underground? And that was my biggest surprise. But I didn't expect to hear the following. So there was a lot going on in the underground, and I just spent days there in that meadow listening to what happens in the ground. And obviously, there weren't only like movement or feeding noises of the animals in the sound hearable, but also communication sounds. So that they communicate acoustically to each other in the underground, which somehow made sense because it's dark in the soil, in the ground, and the appropriate communication form would be an acoustical, I suppose. And out of that experience, we developed a research project called Sounding Soil, which has now 6 partners. One is missing here on that screen. 6 institutional partners that are investigating together the soundscape of soils. Mm-hmm. So what we did actually was, in the meantime, we altered our sensor a little bit and made the lead longer, that it operates as a waveguide in the soil. So it's like an antenna that catches up all acoustic waves and brings them to that piezo element here that makes us able to record and listen to the sounds in the soil. Yeah, as I said, a whole research project developed. We work here intensively together with the Swiss Federal Institute for Forest Research, but also the Federal Institute for Agricultural Management. And as you see here, there's here we record the sounds in the soil, but also have the same sensors lying on the ground for being able to differentiate between what we hear in the soil and above the soil. Everywhere we take a soil sample and identify and count the animals that we find in that sample for being able to compare the animals with the sounds, for knowing what animals we actually hear in the soil. So that's what the people do here in the lab at WSL. They analyze, identify the species and count them. So there are methods that we adapted from other fields of acoustic research. It's mainly the observation of the dynamics in audio recordings, the different sounds that one finds in audio recordings, and that's the so-called ACI, Acoustic Complexity Index. And this complexity index that we use in the analysis of our recordings reflects also something like biodiversity. So simply said, if you the many different sounds that you find in an audio file represent the many different species that are present on site. And here you see an example from the Glacier Bay in Canada. It's a national reserve, so it's an observation during some months in spring, and you see how the dynamics change over time in the composition of species and the complexity of their calls and acoustic emissions. And we do the same, but in the soil. And the soil is a bit different because it's not like when you have a microphone in air, you analyze like the whole spectrum until 20 kilohertz. In the soil, it's much more limited. We record there until 2 kilohertz because everything that is above cannot be transmitted over a long distance because the soil is heavily damping any other noise. So the main communication noises that you hear from the animals are between 100 and 2000 hertz.
You might also be picking up on a lot of like geophony and biophony that's coming out of it. Like, how do you segregate those from within the, the recording spectrum that you've recorded over here?
Yes, that's a good question. That's a big problem. Generally, when you work with acoustics, doesn't matter if you record above ground or below ground, you always record everything. And that means what I like on that is it's a holistic perspective on what's happening in the environment. So you always have everything in a recording, be it the wind, the rain, calls of animals, but also human influence like traffic noise, for instance. So there the work begins actually to filter out noises that you don't want to analyze. Sometimes it's easy because if you have an algorithm like the acoustic complexity index, which look at the dynamics in certain frequency bands, so if you have constant noise, the algorithm isn't very sensitive to that. It only looks at dynamic sounds. So for instance, if you're close to a street, it's not so a problem. But at the other hand, there are bigger problems like rain or wind that can mask everything else that you have in a recording. So it's something like a nice weather research method. But at the other hand, you always gain knowledge about the microclimatic or weather conditions of a certain space, even much more precise than with a weather station, for instance, because especially regarding rain, weather stations, they have a certain delay until they recognize rain. But the microphone detects it instantly because the raindrops are hitting the microphone.
This is perfect, because they say like noise is not the absence of signal, it's the overabundance of signal. We just have to sort of begin to comprehend what sort of data we're getting.
Yeah, that's why also more and more artificial intelligence is used for analyzing audio recordings, because it's a complex set of data in general that's is also complex to analyze. That's one thing I experience very often. At the other hand, if you look to the soil, there's also a bit easier as above ground, because the spectrum that we analyze is much lower. So we talk about 2 kilohertz of a spectrum that we analyze, and this is much easier actually as to have to analyze and get rid of interference in the whole spectrum. Yeah, so what we find out, actually, if you look to that image, so we went in the beginning of our project, we went to over 20 places in Switzerland and recorded the soils just because we wanted to know, are there differences in soils regarding the sounds, and also in relation to land management or soil type. And of course, the soils sounded very differently. That's one thing you see here in that graph, especially if you look at that little square here in the corner. What we saw was, and that was pretty astonishing, as soon as we were in intensively managed arable land, agricultural land, the soil got quiet. So we didn't hear any animals, and that's still our theory that this is strongly linked to the use of fertilizers and pesticides. So once you are in the intensively managed arable land, there are not a lot of animals also in the soil. The opposite is extensively managed grassland. So grassland that is like once in the year cut or managed by cattle, for instance. So there you have a lot of animals and a lot of acoustic complexity. And intensively managed grassland is lower, and of course forest is even lower, because in grassland you have much more animals than in the forest and the soil. That's because the organic layer is much thicker than in the forest. So I just interrupt if you have questions. Huh?
Yeah, I had a question actually that the soil samples or the soil recordings that you're taking, are there like signature sounds or sound waves that you have managed to identify between different strata and different types of soil that end up informing some kind of research in that sense?
You mean other noises?
Yeah.
Geophonic or anthropophonic noises?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. As we discussed before, of course, you hear a lot of other sound also in the soil, be it the water moving through the pores. That's one thing, especially that's one thing you see here in that photo when the sun starts to shine on the ground, it heats it up. and there's a certain evaporation in the upper layers. So that's something you hear, but that's not over present. So most that you hear in the soil are really the animals, and the animals are also the bigger animals. That means everything that is bigger than half of a millimeter is something that we hear. And here we speak mostly about insects living in the soil.
Mm.
And maybe we go to the next slide. That's something I could show you a little bit more detailed. So these are so-called spirographs. That means one circle here is 24 hours, and the duration in a whole graph is about 2-3 months. So here we have 12 o'clock, and here is 6 o'clock. And what we found, and what was interesting us most, were these radar-like patterns. That means the more yellowish the graph gets, the more acoustic complexity we have. And it seemed that at certain times of the day, there was a higher acoustic complexity than at other times. And that was exactly the moment when the sun shined on the ground, on the soil, and heated it up, and the animals became active. And the really bright spark here, that's water coming from an irrigation system that hits the sensor, because one part of the forest where we have been was irrigated for an experiment, actually. But you see,
what is the distance in terms of how far, like in terms of your recordings, like how
much you hear?
Yeah, what do you hear? What is the radius of these sounds?
About one meter. So 1 meter around the sensor, you hear the animals. And you would even hear ultrasonic noises, especially caused by water moving through the pores, but that's very local, very close to the sensor, because that's quickly damped over a short distance in that like heterogeneous structure of the soil. So you see here, that's the measurement that we made. So yellow, that's the sunlight shining on the ground, and orange, that's the soil temperature, and gray is the acoustic complexity. So interesting was actually that the acoustic complexity rose together with the temperature on the surface, but at a certain moment it went down. And that was the moment when the soil temperature became critical for the soil animals, too warm. So they wander like deeper down, and you won't hear them anymore. So it was a little bit the idea of that part of our research, to see the spatial and temporal dynamics of the soil animals' activity, actually. That's something we're going to publish very soon. Yeah, and of course, the question is always, in my work, how can you make art with that? And so we produced this installation, which is a transformed shipment container. And as you already see here on the roof, there's a little garden. And in that garden, there are sensors in the soil going to that weather station, and the weather station sends the data to a computer inside, and the computer produces sonifications like a generative music piece controlled by the soil. But you also, that's the container open, you also see inside, once you go inside, you like in the pot of a plant, because the whole thing looks a little bit like a plant pot. So here inside you are in the soil. So it's dark here, and you see a little bit to the garden above on the rooftop through that holes here. And there's this console where we placed all our recordings we made in Switzerland. So you could really compare the different soils and sounds all over Switzerland. Yeah, that's already the next project, but maybe you have some questions?
But like even the sounds of the sample sites where you took the samples, are they like far away from train line or like a highway?
No, not at all. They are really like in as many different places as you could imagine. So one half was more or less in agricultural land, and the other half was in the forest. But some forests were, for instance, very close to the airport, what was also a problem for us, because we never thought that noises by airplanes could enter into the soil. So that's something you see in our measurements, in our recordings from the soil. We have a lot of air traffic noise.
Okay.
because that's so like a deep frequent sound, which is not reflected at the soil surface, but enters into the soil.
So,
And
so did you find say two similar chemically present soil, like who have like a similar structure? So they would have like somewhat similar diversity of the soil animals, but soil which is also exposed to human sounds, like a plane landing or a train
okay.
crossing. So. Do you think like these sounds have also affected the way these animals have functioned? Like with the warm soil, they are more active, but with like this new environmental disturbance, are they like? I have no clue. Like, are they functioning in a repetitive, similar way, or like there is a difference?
Yeah, it's exactly an experiment that we made. You talk at one hand about repetitions in similar soils. That's what we made this summer in a controlled experiment from the Swiss Institute for Organic Agriculture. And they have this gradient between intensive treatment and organic treatment. So where we really could compare different fields, the dynamics in different fields. And we're right now working on the analysis of that data. So I cannot say too much about that at the moment. At the other hand, that's one thing, that's a very good question because if you think about noise pollution in the seas, for instance, that's one thing which is already quite well explored, and we see there a huge impact on the animals living in the sea caused by human shipping and other stuff. And I'm sure this is also the case in the soil. Why should that be different? But that's something which is completely unexplored, actually. And that's a bit the problem in general. Once you start to work about the soil soundscape, you barely find any literature describing the sounds of the animals in the soil. It's like terra incognita, unknown land, which makes it really fascinating to start research on that. But you barely can reference any literature or like rely on other experiments in that field. So it's very basic research, actually.
Have you been in any way able to identify which animal sources the sounds are, like which animals are contributing to the sources of the sound?
Yes, it's not really the goal of our actual project because that will be very much work to do, especially regarding automatic recognition of certain animals by computer software, and that software we still would have to develop. But at the other hand, of course, I know most of the sounds I hear once I'm working in the field and sticking my needle sensor into the soil. I see them often moving around, be it ants or rainworms or similar animals. So I know their sounds by personal experience, but to work on that scientifically, that would be something like a following project of sounding soils to be able to identify single species, because at the moment it just works statistically, so that the acoustic complexity index is a statistical method to just investigate the biodiversity in soils on a more or less abstract level, just do we have a lot of species or not? And of course, we do not hear every animal in the soil, because especially the smaller animals, be it smaller organisms like bacteria or fungi, that we leave that out because we cannot hear them. So what we hear are something like the primary decomposers, the bigger animals. And what we say there is that can be linked to something like soil health, because when that group is missing, something's wrong with the soil. And that's also one thing I try to make experienceable in my art installation. So to bring all that scientific knowledge on a discursive level and to let people talk about it, because especially here in the container, they're spending some time together listening to the sounds and they start to talk about that. And that's maybe the most important part of all the project, I think. And it's always funny to hear them talking about what they hear, because maybe you remember the recording from before, from the meadow. these sounds are so strange. You can barely describe them by a vocabulary that you already have. So people try to make wild associations. It sounds like a train going through a tunnel or something like that. So they start to be creative, actually, aiming at describing what they hear. And I think that's a very important process, that people get also somehow part of the artwork by their imagination, trying to find the words to describe what they hear.
I think that's where the art science overlap is really crucial, because I think what art sort of makes accessible aesthetically, science sort of humanizes the same concepts. And I think that's a beautiful blend of the two to make people begin conversations, or at least start, revolving conversations around discussing these issues, and, bring it into the general consciousness of discussions that are going around right now.
Yeah, and I think it can be done through creating direct and aesthetical experiences of things that you won't perceive normally. I think that's an important aspect of it. So I think the moment where an artwork starts to work in an acoustical way is always when I put someone headphones on, or they're spending time in an acoustic environment and have this impression in their faces, it's alive. And I think that's a very basic and very important experience to realize, especially regarding the soil. When we move in our daily lives on the ground, we're not aware of that very complex and very alive ecosystem. I think these experiences need to be created.
I think especially when it comes to soil, we sort of take it for granted because it's beneath our feet and it's like out of sight, out of mind most of the time. So we kind of forget that, what lies beneath our feet is a thriving ecosystem at the moment. Yeah.
And what fascinates me, especially with soils, is that many different scientific disciplines come together there. So once you start to analyze or to work on soil, you're confronted with physics, chemistry, biology, and then art, aesthetics, because once you start to dig up the soil, you find a lot of interesting stuff and colors, for instance. So each soil has a different color and different haptics, and it's a very essential thing, actually. That makes it really interesting to work as an artist on that.
Have you tried this sensors in sand? Like somewhere near ocean kind of a sand? Like sand being like the first version of soil, like, or the starter soil kind of a thing?
No, I never tried that. That's because sand is acoustically a pretty difficult structure. Since it's so homogeneous and dries out very quick. There's not, well, maybe close to the sea, but normally once sand is dry, it transmits sounds not at all. So humidity to be transmitted. The sound is transmitted in sand.
Yeah, because close to sea, sand hosts like a lot of animals inside it, like from spiders to crabs to like some animals which I don't know the name of also.
You should start to do that in Goa, doing some research about sand animals.
I not from a sand idea, but I did this thing where I'm throwing a microphone, not a piezo element, but a microphone into the shore of the ocean, and I've not yet captured any animals, but like the sound of the tide going back and the sand absorbing it in a way. So I've been able to sample that. But the waves and the ocean sounds, I don't know, like a digestion system of some monster. It doesn't sound ocean anymore.
I think that's really an interesting point. Interpretation of sound, of recorded sound. What do we hear and how do we interpret it? So that's the moment where imagination starts, and that's why I like it so much to work with sound in general, because it triggers our imagination.
I think we sort of rely a lot more on, like, our visual synapses, and we sort of try to immediately, like our brain tries to make sense of things, of acoustic signals immediately. So like having to listen to the sound of the ocean from within the ocean would be an interesting approach to actually begin with. And likewise, like listening to the soil as well. And you had mentioned something about it being a citizen sort of experiment where citizen participation was encouraged and the farmers were encouraged. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, there's a bigger part of the Sounding Soil project where we have a citizen science project running that's mainly managed by an NGO, which is part of our project. And it's not only the farmers. Well, in the first step, we constructed some soil recorders. We built up some soil recorders, and we borrowed them to the farmers here, to a small number of farmers here in Switzerland. And it was really interesting to observe them how their view changed of their own land, because in the first step, of course, they were all very curious about how their soil would sound. And they were, of course, sure that they hear something, but that was not always the case, really depending on their management of the land. So there was also a difficult discussion because there's especially the topic of using pesticides here in Switzerland became an important political issue. So there will be several initiatives in the next time where we have to go and vote about the protection of the soil and the water from synthetic pesticides. And it became a quite sensitive field of discussion, especially with the farmers that feel very attacked that they treat their land wrong. They somehow do, of course, but at the other hand, there's a lot of polemic going on. Of farmers poisoning the country. So you have to be very careful once you start a dialogue with them. And I think the somehow non-verbal way is to make them listen to their soil, because they have a direct experience of what's happening in their soil and what's the effect of their treatment. Well, that was the first step, which caused a lot of discussions, also fruitful discussions with them. And then we opened it up to the general public. So at the moment, if you go to the Sounding Soil homepage, you can register and register for borrowing a soil recorder for 2 weeks and record your own soil. And the idea behind that is not so much that we use the recordings for our scientific work, but the people have to answer a questionnaire before and after they had the recording. So it's a lot about sensibilization topics that we want to find out. How are people sensibilized by hearing the soil? And of course they are. And that part of the project became really successful. So the recorders are always booked out, and people are really keen on hearing their own gardens or even balcony plants. The limitation is a little bit, the people that are attracted to that offering are already sensibilized for environmental topics. So we're still thinking about how we could reach people that wouldn't do that like by their own initiative. So, and there we're talking much more about younger people, especially in schools. So the goal is really to bring these recorders also to schools and to confront children with what's happening in the soil.
Yeah.
So we have about 3-4 minutes to go, but I think what we can do is just get to a couple of questions, Marcus, that we have that we've got, and maybe you could answer them in brief. So the first one that we have is basically, do you think sound is a language for communicating with organic matter? In the sense, in your experience, is there some kind of a back and forth kind of what do you call it, possibility in terms of using sound as a way to?
You mean to non-human beings?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a topic that is hotly discussed at the moment. And Well, of course, I mean, basically said, everything in our experience universe is vibration, more or less. So is oscillation. You find it on the level of atoms, but also on the level of whole planets. So I think bigger parts of our communication is based maybe not on sound, but on oscillation or vibration. And there, what we, for instance, know, there is interspecies communication between plants and insects. So certain plants detect vibration of bees coming to their flowers, and then make the pollen active for active for I don't know the name in English. So there is interspecies communication. Even in the case when I would talk to my dog, maybe he doesn't understand the words, but he feels he interprets the sound of my voice. So it would be interesting to do now regarding the soil. What happens if soil animals start to emit certain frequencies to the living area? And the question is always there, what is communication in general? So what could be the purpose or the goal of that kind of communication? And are we able to understand each other, and what would be the message that we transmit to animals in general? So there's, just remember that video from a gorilla you find everywhere on YouTube that has learned the sign language with hands. And there's one last video before he died talking about mankind and their relationship to the planet. And I'm still not sure, is that the intention of the gorilla to tell that, or did he learn what he had to say? These are the open questions, but I think regarding this, the general topic of finding new forms of living together with the non-human beings on Earth should include the question, how can we find new forms of communication, non-verbal communication? And there, of course, we're at acoustics.
So one other question that we have is organic matter intelligent or sentient from your personal experiences? I'm guessing they said organic matter, but basically through the recordings, from the soil, what is your experience in terms of the intelligence factor when it comes to these species that you have?
Well, there are theories that I am attracted to, philosophical theories, or also from other disciplines that say there's everywhere intelligence in the universe or in the living environment. The intelligence is just a question of definition and graduality. So an ant somewhere on the forest soil doesn't need to write books, but it's part of a bigger intelligence. So that's one thing I often experience when I'm working in the rainforest in the Amazon. I often have the feeling once I enter the forest, I'm stepping into a big collective intelligence, which I understand very badly, of course, but I always have this impression of 1,000 ears and eyes pointing at me and observing me while I am observing the forest. So, yeah, of course.
Interesting. And one more question is basically, what is the craziest in terms of experience that you've had? Something that maybe you were not totally expecting, or something that totally changed the way you perceive sound generally as one of the ways to perceive the world around us. I mean, just from your experience from all these different research that you
Maybe tell two things I experienced. One I already mentioned. It was the first time I heard the sounds of the animals in the soil. I was really surprised because I thought I wouldn't hear anything, and I wasn't aware that the animals also communicate acoustically in the soils. But what comes also into my mind is in the Amazon I recorded once the call of a bird. And that call was really fascinating. It didn't sound so special actually when you hear it, but once I analyzed it and made the spectrogram out of it, I was really astonished because there were parts of that call in the non-audible domain, in the ultrasonic area, that looked like the drawing of a tree. And what is the meaning for that and the purpose behind that? It's why, who does that hear? And why does that call have the structure of a tree? So these are really the questions that keep me in the field of acoustic ecology and also keep on my fascination for the acoustic investigation of our environment.
What was the name of the bird? Like, were you able to ID it?
In English, it's called the captain of the forest, and it's also some tragic story related to that bird because the bird always starts to call once you move around in the forest. So he warns his co-specifics or any other animal in the same area, and that call has been used for pursuing and catching slaves that escaped in the forest. So that's why the bird is called captain of the forest. So, but I think it's always an interesting thing once you start to do research or work as an artist, the stories that are around certain acoustic phenomena that you should certainly count into the narration you try to develop.
Are there any other questions, or I mean anything else that you'd like to discuss? I mean, we are almost out of time, but Marcus, if there's anything else that you think would be, interesting to kind of hear about. What is the current project that you're currently working on? I mean, you've mentioned there's. Yeah.
Yeah. You already heard that, Farah, but that's a tent for a pirate radio station, an installation that I do for a foundation in Germany, close to Munich. What they did was they bought a quite huge area on the countryside and they try to re-naturalize that area. And it's mainly, consists mainly of very humid areas like moors. And what I do is, it's a long-term project. I will observe the changing landscape, not only the renaturated parts, but also the forest that is dramatically changing with climate change, because there are a lot of trees that are dying now because it's getting too dry in that area. And the name of the project is Posterity. That means, we try to observe what's happening in the next years with a landscape, how a landscape is changing. And so we have everywhere recorders there. And the radio station will transmit the environmental sounds. So you will hear the environment on that radio, on an analog radio emitter, but also on in a web radio stream. And we will have some sonification parts of the local climate. So you hear the sounds of the climate, the sound translation of the climate, but also the sounds, how that landscape is changing over time. And
nice.
That's your program.
Very cool. Awesome. I think we're out of time right now, but I think it was a really interesting conversation. Thank you for joining in.